The stagecoach rolled into Rattlesnake Creek, Colorado, on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1874, and Luke Rhodes noticed her hands before he noticed anything else about her. He had been leaning against the post outside Haggerty's General Store, arms folded across his broad chest, watching the stage come in the way he always did when he rode down from the mountain to resupply. It was a habit of his, this watching. Living alone in the high country for 3 years had made him a student of small details. The way a sky changed color before a storm, the way a deer paused before bolting, the way a fire burned differently depending on the wood. He noticed things. He paid attention. And so when the stagecoach door swung open and a woman stepped down onto the packed dirt of the main street, he noticed her hands first. They were not the hands of a woman who had spent her life in a parlor. They were calloused across the palms and across the base of each finger, the skin roughened and slightly darkened from sun and work, the knuckles a little more prominent than you would expect on a woman of perhaps 28 years. She gripped the iron step handle of the coach as she descended, and the grip was sure and practiced, not tentative. These were the hands of someone who had spent years doing real work, chopping, hauling, building, surviving. And they were, in spite of everything, beautifully shaped. Long fingers, steady wrists, hands that told a story before she opened her mouth. She wore a plain dark dress, nearly black but faded at the hem and elbows to a muted charcoal gray. A small trunk and a leather satchel came down after her, handled by the stage driver with considerably less care than they deserved. She caught the satchel before it hit the dirt and set it at her feet with a quiet efficiency that told Luke she was used to no one looking after her things. She wore her dark brown hair pinned up under a bonnet that had seen better days, but her face beneath it was something that made Luke Rhodes straighten up slowly against the post, as though his spine had received instructions from somewhere outside himself. She had a face that was serious and still, with high cheekbones and a jaw that carried a certain set to it, not hardness exactly, but the look of a woman who had made peace with hard things. Her eyes, even from 20 feet away, were a striking shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were calm, not resigned, not empty. Just calm in the way of someone who has already survived whatever she feared most and discovered she could bear it. Luke realized he had not moved in quite some time. The woman picked up her satchel and her trunk handle without looking around for help and started toward the general store with the purposeful stride of someone who had a list and intended to get through it. Luke stepped back automatically to let her pass, and she did, without looking at him, without looking at much of anything except the door ahead of her. She smelled faintly of cedar, and something else he couldn't quite name, dried lavender, maybe, or the clean mineral smell of high-altitude air she might have passed through on the way here. He stood there after she had gone inside and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had not had a conversation worth having in the better part of a year, and that he very much wanted to have one now. Inside Haggerty's, Mabel Haggerty was already at the counter when the woman came in. Mabel ran the store with her husband Dennis, and had the particular gift of knowing everyone's business within about 48 hours of their arrival in Rattlesnake Creek. She was a broad, warm woman with silver-streaked red hair and a disposition that swung between motherly and nosy in a way that most people found endearing. "Well, hello there, sweetheart," Mabel said, spreading her hands on the counter. "You must be just off the stage." "Yes, ma'am," the woman said, and her voice was quiet, a little low, with a slight roughness in it like she had not used it much lately. "I am looking for the land office. I was told there might be a small parcel available on the east side of Crowder Creek." Mabel's eyebrows rose. "You're the Callahan widow, the one that wrote to Dennis about the land." "Grace Callahan," she said. "Yes." Luke had followed her inside. He would tell himself later that he needed to pick up his flour and salt pork, which was true, but he had also followed her inside because he could not think of a single reason to stand outside in the street any longer. He was close enough now to hear the exchange at the counter, and he positioned himself at the end of the goods shelf with a tin of coffee in his hand, studying it without reading a word on it. "Your letter came about 6 weeks ago," Mabel said. "Dennis got you set up with Harold Finch at the land office. He's just down the street, brown door, second building past the livery. But I'm sorry to hear about your husband. How long has it been?" There was a brief pause, not a long one but noticeable. 14 months, Grace Callahan said. "And you came all the way from, where was it? Kansas, near Dodge." "That is a fair piece of traveling," Mabel said, in a tone that managed to be both admiring and prodding. "All by yourself." "All by myself," Grace said, and there was no self-pity in it, no drama, just a plain statement of fact. Luke set the tin of coffee down on the counter alongside his flour and his salt pork, and Grace Callahan happened to turn slightly at the sound, and for the first time she looked at him. Not a long look, not a particularly warm one. Just a direct, even assessment, the way you might look at weather coming in from the west, practical, noting what was there without judgment. He was a substantial figure to look at, Luke Rhodes. He stood 6'2", built from years of mountain living in a way that a man built by a blacksmith could not quite match. Not the blocky, squared-off muscle of someone who lifted iron, but the lean, layered strength of someone who hauled elk carcasses up steep ridges and split firewood for 6 months of winter and climbed rock faces alone with nothing but his own 2 arms. His hair was dark brown, longer than most men in town wore theirs, brushing the collar of his shirt, and he had a beard that was kept up well enough to be respectable but full enough to be honest about who he was. He wore canvas trousers and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the forearms below those rolled sleeves were roped with muscle, and marked with a thin old scar on the left one that ran from wrist to mid-forearm like a river on a map. He met her eyes and said, "Morning," and immediately felt that the word was insufficient. She gave a single nod and turned back to Mabel to ask about a decent boarding house, and Luke paid for his goods and went outside and stood in the sunshine with his supplies at his feet and tried to remember the last time a single glance had done that to him. He could not. He had been married once, briefly, in his early 20s, to a girl named Clara who had followed him up into the mountains and found within a season that she had not accounted for the loneliness of it, the long winters, the quiet that was immense and pressing and either held you or crushed you depending on your nature. Clara had not been crushed. She had simply left, walked back down the mountain in the 3rd spring and gone to Denver to live with her sister, and they had parted without hatred, only with a mutual sad recognition that they had mistaken a warm feeling for a compatible life. That had been 5 years ago. Luke had not been inclined to try again. He told himself he was not thinking about trying again now. He loaded his supplies into his saddlebags, untied his roan gelding, Samson, from the hitching post, and started back up the main street. He passed the brown door of the land office just as Grace Callahan was going through it, and she did not look back, and he rode out of town telling himself that was that. He made it about 2 miles up the mountain trail before he turned around. He was not a man who acted on impulse ordinarily. He spent most of his days making deliberate, methodical decisions, where to check his trap lines, whether the snow pack on the North Ridge made travel dangerous, how much meat he needed to smoke before the next cold snap. But there was a logic to turning around that he could not argue against, and it had nothing to do with impulse and everything to do with something simpler. He knew something about the land on Crowder Creek. He had trapped and hunted that ground for years. If she was buying a parcel there and planning to work it alone, which was plainly her intention, there were things she would need to know that Harold Finch at the land office was unlikely to tell her. That was what he told himself, and it was even partially true. He rode back into Rattlesnake Creek and tied Samson at the hitching post outside the land office and waited. It took another 20 minutes, but eventually the door opened and Grace Callahan came out with a folded document in one hand and the expression of a woman who had just done something she could not undo and was at peace with that. She saw him standing there and stopped walking. "You were in the general store," she said. It was not a question, just a placement of him in her memory. She did not look suspicious, only precise. "Luke Rhodes," he said. "I trap and hunt the high country. I know the east side of Crowder Creek pretty well." She waited, holding the document, not filling the silence with anything. "The parcel Finch sold you," Luke said, "has good soil along the creek bottom, south-facing slope on the lower third, which is good for a kitchen garden. But the well that's listed on that deed paperwork dried up 2 summers ago. You would need to locate a new water source before you tried to overwinter there." She looked at him steadily. "How do you know about that deed paperwork?" "I don't. But there's only one parcel on the east side of Crowder Creek that's been sitting empty long enough to be available, and the Morrow family abandoned it partly because of the well." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. She looked down at the document in her hand and then back up at him with those gray-green eyes. "Is there water on that land?" she said. "There is," Luke said. "About 40 yards east of where the old well was sunk. There's a seep fed by a limestone shelf. You would need to dig it out properly, but it runs year-round. I have seen it in January." She was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them, a wagon rolling past, 2 men talking outside the saloon, a dog cutting across the road at an angle, and she seemed to consider all of this without any particular hurry. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. It was a fair question. Luke thought about giving her a version of the answer that was smaller and safer than the real one, and then decided against it because she was the kind of woman who would likely recognize a smaller answer when she heard one. "Because you are about to go out there alone," he said, "and if you get through your first summer without finding water, you will have a very bad winter, and that would be a waste." "A waste," she repeated. "Of good land," he said, "and good effort." She looked at him for a moment longer with that direct, appraising look, and then she gave the smallest possible hint of what might have been a smile, not quite there, not quite not there, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Rhodes." "Luke," he said. She nodded once and said, "Thank you, Luke," and walked off toward the boarding house, and he watched her go with the distinct feeling that something had just begun that was going to be very difficult to stop. The east parcel on Crowder Creek was a 40-acre piece of land that sat in a broad, gentle valley bowl, about 4 miles south of Rattlesnake Creek's main street. It had a cabin on it, small but solidly built by the Morrow family a decade earlier, with a stone fireplace and a loft and a root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the main floor. The cabin needed work. A section of chinking had fallen out between 2 wall logs, one window shutter had lost a hinge and hung at an angle, and the roof over the south end had developed a slow leak that had left a dark stain on the ceiling boards, but the bones of it were good. Grace Callahan walked through it twice the morning after she arrived, and she did not flinch at any of it. She had been a homesteader's wife for 6 years in Kansas, from the age of 22 to 28, and before that she had grown up on a farm in Missouri that had been worked by her father and herself and her 2 brothers. And before that she had simply been a girl who understood that the world did not rearrange itself for comfort, that if you wanted a particular kind of life, you put your hands to it and you built it. Thomas Callahan had understood that about her from the start, and it had been one of the things she had loved about him, that he valued it, that he did not try to soften her edges or redirect her toward finer things. Thomas had died of a fever in January of 1873, and she had buried him in the Kansas ground and spent 14 months tying off what could be tied off and making a decision about what came next, and what came next was this: her own land, her own hands, her own account. She was not looking for anyone. She had not come to Rattlesnake Creek to find anyone. She had come because the land was available and affordable, and the altitude meant shorter growing seasons but also less disease, and the mountains around the valley were beautiful in a way that the flat Kansas sky, for all its drama, had never been. She had come because she wanted to look up. She spent the first week in the boarding house run by a woman named Elsa Pryor, a lean, efficient Norwegian-American widow of about 50 who ran a quiet, clean establishment and asked almost no questions, which Grace appreciated enormously. During that week, she made 4 trips out to the Crowder Creek parcel with a borrowed wagon and began the work of assessing what needed to be done. She made lists in a small, leather-bound notebook. She consulted the lists. She revised them. She bought what supplies she could afford from Haggerty's and made arrangements with Dennis Haggerty for credit on the rest against her first harvest. On Thursday of that first week, she drove the borrowed wagon out to the parcel in the early morning, intending to clear the collapsed section of the south fence line, and found Luke Rhodes already there. He was standing about 40 yards east of the old well site, ankle-deep in the tall grass, using a long iron rod to probe the ground in a slow, methodical grid. He had a large chestnut horse tied to a cottonwood at the creek bank, and a small kit of tools on the ground beside him. He did not appear to hear her wagon until she was fairly close, at which point he looked up, and if he was surprised to see her, he covered it well. "You found the seep," she said, climbing down from the wagon and walking across the meadow grass toward him. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of spring morning in the Colorado mountains that was almost aggressively beautiful, with the snow still sitting on the high peaks to the west and the lower meadows already gone green and wild with columbine. "Found it," he said. "It is here, right enough. About 3 feet down you hit the shelf and it is running clean and cold. If you dig out a proper pit about 4 feet wide and line it with stone, you will have a reliable source." She walked to where he stood and looked at the patch of ground, which was indeed slightly damp and showed a faint green darkening in the grass that indicated subsurface moisture. She crouched down and pressed her palm against the earth and felt the coolness of it. "I can dig," she said. "I know you can," Luke said. She looked up at him. He was not being condescending. He said it simply as a statement of fact in the same tone he had used when he told her about the limestone shelf. She stood up. "Why are you here?" she said, not unkindly, just directly. He considered the question with an honesty she was already beginning to recognize as characteristic. "I had a day to spare," he said. "And this is useful work." She could have sent him away. She was aware of that. She was also aware that having an experienced mountain man who knew this particular ground standing here probing for water was considerably more useful than doing without him, and she was not a woman who confused pride with stubbornness. She had long since learned the difference. "There is a spare iron rod in the wagon," she said. "You can use it." They worked side by side through the morning without much talk, probing the ground in expanding rings from the central point Luke had identified, mapping the edges of the limestone shelf, determining the best place for the dig. When the sun was high and the day had warmed considerably, Grace produced a cloth-wrapped bundle from the wagon that turned out to contain corn bread and hard cheese and a jar of cold water, and they sat on the tailgate of the wagon and ate. "Did you know the Morrows?" she said. "Some. Cal Morrow was a decent man. Worked himself too hard for what the land gave back. Wife took sick in the winter of '71 and that broke the will of it for him. They went back east." "What did they grow?" "Some wheat." "Kept pigs. Had a small apple orchard on the north bench that is probably still there, gone wild by now." Grace looked at him. "An apple orchard." "About a dozen trees," Luke said. "You might be able to bring them back." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the cabin, the meadow, the line of cottonwoods along the creek. "I am going to plant a kitchen garden this season," she said. "Beans, squash, potatoes, I have seed. If I can get a reliable water source, I can irrigate through the dry stretch in July." "You can," Luke said. "This creek does not run dry. It drops in late summer, but there is always water." She turned to look at him, and for a moment the directness of her gaze was such that he felt it the way you feel a fire, not uncomfortable but noticeable, like warmth on your face. "You are being very helpful to me," she said. "And I do not entirely understand why." He held her gaze. "Neither do I," he said honestly, "entirely." Something passed between them in that moment, not named, not acted upon, but present the way a deer in tall grass is present. You feel its weight in the air before you see it. Then Grace Callahan looked away and took a drink of water and said, "Well, We had better start on that dig," and slid off the tailgate and went and got the iron rod. They dug the pit that afternoon together, trading off at the handle of the spade Luke had brought in his saddlebag. And by the time the light was going orange and long, they had a 4-foot wide, 3-foot deep pit, with clean, cold water seeping steadily across the stone floor of it. Grace knelt at the edge of it and put her hand in and held it there, feeling the cold of mountain water against her calloused palm, and something in her face softened in a way that Luke, watching from a few feet away, thought he might be thinking about for a long time. "It is good water," she said. "Best water on this side of the mountain," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at it with an expression of quiet satisfaction, and then she looked up at him and said, "Thank you, Luke." He said, "You are welcome, Grace," and it was the first time he had used her name, and they both noticed it. Over the weeks that followed, Luke Rhodes came down from his mountain more often than he had any practical reason to. He told himself the first time that he was checking on the water pit. He told himself the second time that he had extra venison and no use for all of it. He told himself the third time that the fence line on the south boundary was in visible need of repair, and he had an afternoon to fill, which was partially true. By the fourth and fifth times he stopped telling himself things and simply rode down the mountain in the early morning, and showed up at Grace Callahan's parcel with his tools and his horse and a willingness to do whatever needed doing. She let him. She did not make a fuss about it, did not treat it with romantic significance in any of the ways he might have feared, no coyness, no particular warmth that made him feel the weight of an expectation. She simply worked alongside him as she might work alongside a capable neighbor, and she talked to him in the direct, considered way she seemed to talk to everyone, and gradually, without hurry, she let him see more of who she was. He learned that she had grown up on a farm near Westport, Missouri, the second of 4 children, and that her father had been a man who believed women were capable of any labor a man could do, which was either progressive or practical depending on how you looked at it, but either way it had shaped her. He learned that she had met Thomas Callahan at a church social when she was 21, and that they had married within the year, and that the Kansas homestead had been their project together, built from nothing. He learned that Thomas had been sick for less than 2 weeks before he was gone, and that the speed of it had left her, in her own words, without time to refuse it. He learned that she could identify 17 varieties of edible wild plant by sight, and that she kept a small journal in which she pressed specimens, and that she had taught herself to use a rifle at the age of 12, and that she made the best sourdough bread he had ever tasted in his life, which he told her the first time she offered him a slice, sitting on her front step in the afternoon light. "It is just bread," she said. "No, it is not," he said, and she gave him that almost smile again. He learned she was 28 years old. He was 32. He did not think of the 4 years between them as anything at all. He learned slowly that beneath the calm and the competence and the self-sufficiency, there was a loneliness in her that she had made her peace with but had not defeated. He saw it sometimes in the way she watched the sun go down over the western peaks, not with sadness exactly, but with a kind of enormous quietness, as if she were keeping company with something too large and too personal to share. He did not push at it. He recognized it. He had his own version of it. They were side by side on a late May afternoon, patching the section of chinking in the cabin wall, working from the inside while the last light came through the window and lay gold across the floor. The work required them to be close, one holding the wet mud and straw mixture in a bucket while the other worked it into the gap between the logs, and there was an easy silence between them of the kind that only comes between people who have spent enough time together to stop managing the quiet. "Tell me about the mountain," Grace said, without looking away from the wall she was working. "What it is like up there, where you live." Luke thought about it with the consideration he gave most things. "It is like being in a different country," he said. "The air is different, thinner but cleaner. In the mornings you can see for 100 miles if the weather is clear. Elk come through the meadow below my cabin in September, whole herds of them, and you can hear them talking at night, this sound they make, and there is nothing else like it." She paused in her work and looked at him. "Are you lonely?" she said. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "Mostly it suits me. Sometimes it does not." She nodded slowly, as if this answered something, and went back to the wall. "Thomas did not like the quiet," she said after a moment. "He always needed noise around him, people, activity. I think he found me difficult sometimes because I am comfortable with silence." "I don't find you difficult," Luke said. She looked at him again, and this time the look held a little longer than usual, and there was something in it that was not quite her usual calm assessment. Something warmer, something that was considering a possibility. "No," she said quietly. "I don't suppose you do." The apple orchard on the north bench was, as Luke had predicted, wild and overgrown but not dead. Grace found it on a Sunday morning in early June when she was exploring the far edges of her parcel, and she stood in the middle of the straggling, half-wild trees for a long time, studying them. Several had gone to suckers at the base and needed hard cutting back. The shape of them had gone ragged, with crossing branches and dead wood, but the root systems were intact, and several of the trees were in bloom, small and pale and stubborn, with a sweetness in the air that she walked into as if it were a room. She told Luke about it when he came down that Wednesday, and he went with her to look at them, and spent the better part of 2 days helping her cut and clear and shape, working with a quiet knowledge of trees that she had not expected. He explained to her which cuts would encourage fruit-bearing growth and which would drain the tree's energy, and she watched his hands as he worked, the sureness of them, the easy power in them, and thought that there was something clarifying about watching a person who knew exactly what they were doing. On the second evening, as they were finishing up, she asked him where he had learned about pruning apple trees. "My father's farm," he said. "Vermont, originally. He had an orchard." "You grew up in Vermont?" "Until I was 14. Then we came west. My father had an idea about land in Kansas, not unlike most people." He paused, cutting a water sprout from the base of the nearest tree. "It did not work out the way he hoped. He was not a man who took to hard circumstances with much grace. My mother did better." "What happened to them?" "My mother passed in 1868. My father is in Denver. We are not close." He said it without bitterness, just as a plain set of facts, and she heard the years of distance in it and did not press. "And you came to the mountains," she said. "Eventually," he said. "I tried several things first. Drove cattle for a while. Scouted for a survey team one season. Worked in a silver mine for 3 months and found I could not bear being underground." He looked up from his work at the peaks visible above the tree line. "When I got up into the high country the first time, I knew it was where I belonged. It took me a while to stop fighting it. Fighting it. The idea that a man is supposed to have more to show for himself," Luke said. "A business, a family, something measurable." He looked at her directly. "I stopped needing it to be measurable a few years ago." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think that is a kind of wisdom." "I think it might just be stubbornness," he said, and she laughed, a real laugh, fuller and more open than her usual careful expression, and the sound of it moved through the apple orchard and off into the blue Colorado evening, and Luke Rhodes stood among the half-wild trees and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in so long he had almost stopped believing it was still possible. He loved her. He had loved her, he suspected, from the moment he saw her hands on the iron step of the stagecoach door. It had simply taken this long for the word to find him, and now that it had, it was so thoroughly and quietly the truth that it did not frighten him. It only made him careful. Because she was not a woman you rushed. She was not a woman who needed anyone to rush her. She was a woman who had survived enormous things by moving at exactly the speed that was right for her, and the only decent thing to do was honor that. He said nothing about it that evening. He helped her carry the cut branches to a burn pile at the edge of the orchard, and they walked back to the cabin in the soft late light, and she made coffee and they sat on the front step as they sometimes did, not talking much, watching the sky go through its colors over the mountain, and it was enough. For now, it was more than enough. June became July, and Grace's kitchen garden came up strong. The beans went in first, then the squash, then the potatoes, and she had added, on an impulse she could not quite explain, a row of sunflowers along the south fence that grew with a cheerful indifference to anything difficult that she found she liked enormously. She had done what she could on the roof leak, packed the gap with a pitch compound she had made herself from pine resin and ash, and the south shutter was rehung, and the chinking was solid, and the cabin felt, for the first time, like something she had made rather than something she had inherited. Rattlesnake Creek itself had begun to feel familiar. She knew Mabel Haggerty's particular brand of warm nosiness now, and she had made something approaching friendship with a woman named Dorothea Sims, who ran the town's seamstress shop and had a dry, precise wit that Grace respected. She had been to 2 church services and a town meeting in the one-room schoolhouse where issues of road maintenance and water rights were debated with a passionate intensity that she found both useful and mildly amusing. She had also, without entirely meaning to, become someone who watched for Luke Rhodes every time she came into town, and someone who noticed when 3 or 4 days went by without a visit from him, and someone who had started keeping an extra coffee cup on the shelf. She was not a woman who deceived herself. She had survived too much for that luxury. She knew what the extra coffee cup meant. She knew what it meant that she had described the color of his eyes dark brown, flecked with gold near the center, the way creek water looks over a gravel bed on a sunny day, in the small journal she kept, and that the description ran for nearly half a page. She knew what it meant that when he was working near her and the wind changed direction, she turned toward him rather than away. She did not know what to do about it. Or rather, she knew very well what could be done, but she did not know what should be done, and the distinction mattered to her. She had loved Thomas Callahan truly and completely, and losing him had cost her something she could not fully account for even now, and the question of whether she had enough left to give to someone else was not a question she took lightly. She asked Elsa Pryor about it, on a warm evening when she had ridden into town to deliver a jar of preserves she had made from the first wild strawberries of the season. She did not ask it directly, she asked it sideways, in the way that such questions get asked between women who respect each other. "Elsa," she said, sitting at the boarding house kitchen table with a cup of tea, "your husband has been gone 8 years. Have you ever thought about trying again?" Elsa Pryor looked at her with those calm Scandinavian eyes and said, "I have thought about it, yes, and decided against it for myself. But I did not have a reason to think about it, which is different from having one." Grace wrapped both hands around her teacup. "How do you know when a reason is real and not just loneliness?" Elsa was quiet for a moment. "You ask yourself whether the person makes you feel more like yourself or less," she said. "Loneliness wants anything that fills the space. Love wants that particular person because that particular person makes the world more true." Grace thought about this. She thought about the way she talked with Luke, the easy directness of it, the sense that she did not edit herself around him. She thought about the fact that she was, if anything, more herself on the days he came down from the mountain, more willing to laugh, more willing to say what she thought, more willing to stand in the middle of her wild apple orchard and feel happy about it. "I see," she said. Elsa smiled. "The mountain man," she said. Grace gave her a dry look. "Is it that obvious?" "In a town this size," Elsa said, "everything is obvious, but no, it is not just that. He looks at you, Grace, the way a man looks at something he cannot believe is real." Luke was up on the mountain in the second week of July, running his summer trap lines and smoking meat for his autumn stores, when he heard from a passing trapper named Coyle that there had been some trouble at the Crowder Creek parcel. "What kind of trouble?" he said, in a voice that came out quieter and flatter than he intended. Coyle, who was a thin, weather-beaten man of about 50 with a talent for the kind of gossip that passed as news in the mountains, said that a couple of men from the Delaney operation, a cattle concern that had been trying to expand its grazing rights south along the valley for the better part of a year, had ridden through the parcel and had words with the widow there. Luke was breaking camp within the hour. He rode down the mountain at a pace that made Sampson work, following the switchback trail in the early afternoon, and arrived at Grace's parcel before the sun had dropped to the peaks. He found her at the root cellar, sorting through the potatoes she had pulled early to check for blight, and he read her face the moment she looked up at him, composed, controlled, but with a tension in it that was not usually there. "I heard there was trouble," he said, dropping from Sampson's back. "Nothing I could not handle," she said, setting down a potato and straightening up. "Two riders from the Delaney ranch. They told me this parcel was being considered for grazing expansion and that I might want to reconsider my position here." "Might want to," Luke repeated. "In the tone that means they believed I would be afraid," Grace said. There was a spark of something in her eyes that was not fear. "I told them that I had a legal deed, that I had a right to my property, and that they should speak with their employer about the difference between wanting something and having a right to it." Luke looked at her steadily. And they rode off," she said. "But the taller one, Hayes, he said his name was, looked back once in a way I did not particularly like." Luke's jaw tightened. He was not a man who looked for confrontation, but the idea of two men riding onto Grace Callahan's land and speaking to her in a threatening tone created something in his chest that was not entirely quiet. "Has Delaney been pressing other parcels?" he said. "I asked Dennis Haggerty," she said. "He says Delaney has been making overtures to several small landholders on the south side of the valley. Most of them are holding firm, but the Andersons sold out in May." "I know Delaney," Luke said. "He is the kind of man who mistakes size for right. He will test the edges, but if you hold firm and make clear you have support, he generally moves on to easier territory." Grace was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that told him exactly how much it had affected her despite her composure. "I did not come all this way," she said, "to be pushed off my own land." There was a fierce, quiet certainty in her voice that he heard all the way down to something fundamental in himself, and he said, "No, you did not, and you will not be." He meant it in the plainest possible way, and she heard it that way. They rode into town the following morning. Grace on the bay mare she had purchased from the livery in June and Luke on Sampson, and they went to see Harold Finch at the land office to establish formally that the deed was airtight. And then they went to see the county sheriff, a methodical man named Walt Prescott, who was aware of Delaney's activities and not entirely unsympathetic, though he was also careful. "What I can tell you," Sheriff Prescott said, "is that as long as you are on your own legal property and no physical harm is done, there is not a great deal more I can do than speak to Delaney, which I will do." "Then please do it," Grace said, with a quiet authority that made the sheriff shift slightly in his chair. "Yes, ma'am," he said. On the way back from the sheriff's office, they passed the Haggerty store, and Mabel came to the door with the deliberate casualness of someone who had been watching for them. "I heard those Delaney boys were out at your place," she said to Grace. "You are all right, perfectly all right," Grace said. "Luke," Mabel said, with a look that managed to communicate approximately 4 different things at once, all of them about the fact that he was riding alongside Grace Callahan on a weekday morning. "You coming down from the mountain more often these days?" "Getting old," Luke said pleasantly. "The knees prefer lower altitude." Mabel Haggerty gave him a look of absolute disbelief and went back inside, and Grace, beside him, made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. No further riders came from the Delaney operation. Whether it was the visit to the sheriff or the news that had apparently circulated through town that Luke Rhodes was spending considerable time at the Crowder Creek parcel, Grace did not know, but the silence from that quarter was complete, and she was grateful for it. The summer deepened. The beans came in heavy, and Grace preserved them in a row of glass jars on the root cellar shelves. The squash grew large and orange, filling the garden with a warmth of color that made her unreasonably happy every time she looked at it. The wild apple orchard on the north bench was bearing fruit for the first time in years, small and hard still in August, but already promising a September sweetness. Luke brought her venison in late July and again in August, and she thanked him and cooked it and fed it back to him on evenings when he stayed late enough that the practical thing was to eat before he rode back up the mountain. These evenings became their own particular kind of world, the two of them at the small table in the cabin, the fire low in the summer heat, eating by the yellow light of the oil lamp, talking in the easy, wide-ranging way that had become characteristic between them. They talked about everything. They talked about books. Both of them were readers, and the discovery of this in each other had the quality of an unexpected gift, given the circumstances. They talked about the mountains, which Luke knew with an intimacy that Grace found endlessly interesting, and about farming, which she knew the same way. They talked about the political currents running through the territory. Colorado was not yet a state, would not be until 1876, and the question of statehood was a live one in every town in the territory. They talked about the injustices that ran alongside all of this expansion, the Ute people being steadily and wrongfully pushed from land that had been theirs for generations, their rights and their lives subordinated to the appetite of settlers and prospectors, and both Luke and Grace were clear-eyed enough to sit with the discomfort of that truth rather than looking away from it. "I think about it often," Grace said one evening, "that everything I am building here is built on a claim that someone else had first. I don't know what to do with that." "I don't either," Luke said. "I spent time up in the high country alongside Ute hunters early on, good men. They know that land better than anyone alive. What is being done to them is wrong. Saying so doesn't fix it, but I think the least a person can do is not pretend it isn't happening." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "the least." It was on an evening in the second week of August, with the summer settling toward its peak heat and the mountains going a deeper shade of green in the late light, that things between them shifted. They had been sitting on the front step in the way they often did after supper, and Grace had been telling him about a letter she had received that day from her younger brother in Missouri, who was getting married in the fall, and she had been happy about it and a little sad about the distance, and the emotion in her voice was something she did not bother hiding because she had long since stopped managing herself around Luke Rhodes. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. The evening light was long and gold, and it caught the planes of his face in a way that made him look like something out of a painting, all angle and shadow and quiet strength. "All right," she said. "I think you know," he said, "that I am not coming down from this mountain 3 times a week to check on a water pit." She let out a slow breath. "I know," she said. "I don't want to make something difficult that isn't difficult," he said. "I only want to tell you the truth of it because you are someone who values that, and I think you deserve it. I love you, Grace. I have loved you since before I understood why, and I love you now as clearly as I have ever understood anything." The evening was very quiet. A bird called somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek. The last sunlight touched the tops of the western peaks with a color that had no name. Grace looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I have been afraid of this." "I know," he said. "Not of you," she said. "Of what it costs to love someone and lose them. I know the price of it. I know it exactly." "I know," he said again. "And I think," she said slowly, "that I have been sitting here for weeks deciding whether the cost is worth risking." She paused. "And I think I have decided." His heart was very still, waiting. "I think you make the world more true," she said. He understood exactly what she meant. He reached across the narrow space between them on the step and took her hand, those calloused, capable, beautiful hands that he had noticed before she ever said a word. And she turned her hand in his and held it. And they sat there in the Colorado evening, with the mountains going purple and rose above them and the creek talking quietly below. And everything that needed to be said had been said, and the rest was just beginning. He kissed her for the first time 2 evenings later, on a Saturday when he had come down early and they had spent the whole day working the orchard together and eating lunch in the grass below the trees. And by the time the light was going and they were walking back to the cabin with the day between them like something they had made together, it seemed not only natural but inevitable, the way the seasons are inevitable. The way the creeks run to the valley is inevitable, not forced, only true. He stopped walking and she stopped beside him and looked up at him, and he cupped her jaw in his hand as if she were something he was terrified of breaking, and as if she were also the most solid thing he had ever touched, and kissed her with a gentleness that was at odds with the size and strength of him and was precisely right because of it. She kissed him back without hesitation, and her calloused hands came up and pressed flat against his chest, and he felt them there like a seal, like a fact. When they separated, she looked at him with those gray-green eyes and said, with the ghost of her almost smile, "I was beginning to wonder if you were ever going to do that." "I did not want to rush you," he said. "You have been remarkably patient," she agreed, and he laughed, a full, open laugh that she had not heard from him before and that she immediately decided she wanted to hear as many times as possible. August slid into September in the way the mountains do their changing, with a swiftness that catches you even when you are watching for it. The aspens on the high slopes went from green to gold nearly overnight, and the air changed its quality from warm and still to something bright and keen-edged, full of wood smoke and pine, and the mineral sharpness of coming cold. Grace's potato harvest came in well, filling the root cellar with a satisfying density of stored food. The apple orchard on the north bench gave up its first crop in years, not a large harvest, but real, true apples, tart and dense and brilliant red, and she and Luke picked them on a gold-drenched September afternoon and filled 2-bushel baskets, and she made pies and preserves and dried rings on strings hung from the cabin rafters. Luke had begun to speak practically about the winter, about what she would need and what she should have on hand, and the practicality of it was its own kind of love, this man who knew the mountain thinking ahead on her behalf without making her feel as if she could not think ahead herself. "The winter here is serious," he told her one afternoon. "Not as brutal as the high country, but significant. You will want your wood in by October. At least 4 cords. I'll help you cut and split." "I was going to hire that done," she said. "You could," he said, "or I could do it." She looked at him. "You are going to spend your September splitting my firewood." "If you will let me," he said. She thought about it. "I will let you," she said, "on condition that you let me feed you while you do it." "That seems fair," he said, "and that you stop pretending you are doing me a favor," she said, "because we both know you are doing it because you want to be here." He smiled at her, one of those full, genuine smiles that transformed his face and that she had been cataloging since June. "That is also true," he said. The question of what they were to each other was beginning to make itself felt in the way such questions do in small frontier towns, through the medium of everyone else's awareness of it. By September, it was understood in Rattlesnake Creek that Luke Rhodes and the Callahan widow were in some stage of courtship, and this was discussed with varying degrees of approval and curiosity by the town's population. Mabel Haggerty approved enthusiastically and said so to anyone who would listen. Elsa Pryor gave Grace a single nod of acknowledgement that communicated deep satisfaction without a word. A few of the older men in town took the position that a mountain man was not a reliable prospect for a woman looking to settle, and said this within earshot of Luke, who heard it and said nothing because he was thinking about it himself. It was something he turned over in the long hours alone on the mountain. Was he reliable? He had built a life in the high country that served him completely and served no one else, and that was not a criticism of himself. It was simply a fact. And Grace Callahan had built a life on Crowder Creek that was exactly and deliberately her own, and the last thing in the world she needed was a man who tried to absorb it. He did not want to absorb her life. He did not want to change her or direct her or own her, any more than he wanted to own the mountain or the elk that came through his meadow in September. What he wanted, he understood clearly, was to be part of the life she was building while remaining himself, and to let her be part of whatever he was, and to see what the two of them could make together that neither could make alone. He talked to her about this one evening with the directness that was the native language between them, sitting at her table with coffee cups and the autumn dark pressing soft against the cabin windows. I think about what it means to ask you to take me on, he said. What that requires from you. What it requires from me, she repeated. You have built something here that is yours, he said. You did it alone and deliberately. I don't want to walk in and have it become mine. She looked at him steadily. Then don't, she said. I mean it, Grace. I want to be with you, but not in a way that takes anything from you. Not your land, not your independence, not your own account of who you are. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that he would think about for years. Luke, she said, the only man who tried to diminish me was a man who was afraid of what I was. You are not afraid of what I am. So there is no danger of it. He looked at her. You make me more, she said, not less. That is the only thing I needed to know. He proposed to her on a Saturday in October in the apple orchard. He had carried the ring up from Denver on a supply run he had made in mid-September, not because it was elaborate. It was a simple gold band with a small garnet set into it, deep red like the apples, but because he wanted the intention to be clear, wanted her to know that what he was asking was not a convenience or a compromise, but a complete and serious wanting of her, of the specific, particular, irreplaceable Grace Callahan. With her calloused hands and her gray-green eyes and her sourdough bread and her apple orchard and her list-making notebook and her bone-deep capability, and the way she laughed, full and open, on the days she let herself. He asked her in the simplest words because he was not a man for speeches, and the simplest words were the truest. He said, Grace, I would like to spend the rest of my life making a world with you. Will you marry me? She was standing in the apple orchard with a half-full basket of the last autumn apples, wearing her brown work coat with the collar turned up against the October cold, and she looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not difficult to read if you knew her face as well as he knew it now. Yes, she said, I will. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it against the roughness of her hand and then looked up at him. And the expression on her face in that moment, in the thin October sunlight among the half-wild apple trees, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They were married in late November of 1874, in the little church in Rattlesnake Creek on a Saturday that was cold and clear, with snow on the peaks and the valley floor bare and brown and waiting. The whole town came. Mabel Haggerty cried from the first minute. Elsa Pryor did not cry but sat in the front pew with an expression of profound satisfaction. Dorothea Sims had made Grace a dress of dark blue wool, fitted and beautiful, with small buttons down the front that Grace had picked out herself. Luke stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, clean-shaved for the occasion, though Grace had told him privately that she had nothing against the beard, and when she came down the aisle, he had the look of a man who had stopped breathing. She walked to him without anyone's arm to take, which was perhaps the most Grace Callahan thing possible, and she looked at him through the whole of the short ceremony with a calm certainty that was worth more to him than any performance of emotion. When the minister said the words and Luke slid the ring onto her finger, she pressed her free hand flat against his chest the way she had the first time she kissed him, and he felt it there like the truest, most serious thing in the world. The winter was harder than the previous 2 years, people in town said. The snows came in December and came heavily, and the valley lay under white for weeks at a time, and the cold moved in off the mountains with a genuine authority that tested everyone's preparations. Grace's cabin was solid and warm, the 4 cords of firewood stacked against the south wall doing exactly what they were supposed to do, the root cellar full and organized, the water source reliably clear even in the coldest weeks. Luke had not moved down from the mountain entirely. His cabin and his trap lines were his life's work, and he would not abandon them. But the pattern they settled into was practical and satisfying. He spent 4 or 5 days a week at the Crowder Creek cabin, and 2 or 3 up the mountain checking his lines and tending his winter work. And on the days he was away, Grace was no less capable or content than she had ever been, because the arrangement was not one of dependence. She had her work, her land, her preserved stores, her journal, her apple orchard buried under snow that would come back in spring. He had his mountain, his trap lines, his elk meadow, his vast sky. And they had each other, in the particular way two self-sufficient people come to have each other, not as completion or completion's fiction, but as enlargement. The world was larger and richer with the other person in it. On the long winter evenings, they read to each other from the small library Grace had assembled. She had a Shakespeare, a King James Bible, a battered copy of David Copperfield, a book on Rocky Mountain botany that Luke had given her as a wedding gift, and a collection of Robert Burns' poetry that had belonged to Thomas Callahan, and that she kept because she had loved the poems without reservation, and she saw no reason to stop. Luke brought 2 books of his own from the mountain cabin, a history of the Western Territories, and a translation of Homer that had traveled west with him from his mother's house in Vermont. They read out loud on winter evenings with the fire loud and the snow quiet outside, and there was in this, in the ordinary domestic pleasure of it, something that Grace recognized as the specific gravity of happiness. She missed Thomas sometimes. She did not feel guilty about this. She had loved him, and the missing of him was part of the truth of that, and she had not tried to bury it when she married Luke because burying it would have been a lie, and Luke Rhodes was a man who could bear the truth of her, all of it. She had told him this directly, early in the winter, sitting by the fire with her book closed in her lap. "I want you to know that I still grieve Thomas sometimes," she said. "Not every day, but sometimes, and I did not want you to not know that." He looked at her from across the fire. "I know that," he said. "I would think less of you if you didn't." "It doesn't diminish what this is," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't. What you had with him is its own thing. What we have is its own thing. They don't compete." She looked at him with such complete gratitude for his understanding that she felt it physically. "Thomas would have liked you," she said. "I am glad to hear it," Luke said simply, and went back to his Homer. Spring came to the Crowder Creek Valley in late March, startling and emphatic, with the snowmelt running cold and clear through the creek, and the first green shooting up through the matted winter grass, and the aspens on the upper slopes beginning their slow gold-to-green reversal. Grace went out on the first warm morning and walked her whole 40 acres in a circuit, checking the fence lines, reading the state of the soil, noting what the winter had done and what it had not done, feeling the land under her boots with a particular attentiveness that had always been one of the deepest pleasures available to her. The apple orchard was intact. She checked each tree carefully, the way Luke had taught her, and all 12 had come through, and several were already showing the swollen buds that would become this year's blossoms. She stood among them for a long time in the new March light and felt something so large and quiet that she had no word for it, only the awareness that she had built something real here, in this soil, with these hands, and that it was hers and it was good. Luke found her there when he came down from the mountain that afternoon, standing in the orchard with her hand on the bark of the largest apple tree, and he came and stood beside her without saying anything because he understood her silences. "They made it," she said. "They did," he said. She turned and leaned into him, which she did more easily now than she had in the beginning, and he put his arm around her and they stood in the apple orchard in the spring afternoon, and the mountains looked down at them from every direction, enormous and enduring, the way they had looked down on everything before and would look down on everything after, indifferent and beautiful. In May of 1875, Grace told him she was pregnant. She told him the way she told him most things, directly, plainly, watching his face for his response. She had made coffee and put it on the table and sat down across from him and said, "I believe we are going to have a child." Luke Rhodes looked at her for a moment with an expression that she would try to describe later in her journal and find she could not do justice to. It was not surprise exactly, or only partly surprise, and it was not simply joy, or only partly joy. It was something closer to what happens when a man who has not quite believed in something has it laid in his hands like a fact, solid and warm and entirely real. "Grace," he said. "I know," she said. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands, those hands, always those hands that he had loved from the very beginning, and held them in both of his and looked at her face. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly all right," she said with her almost smile. "I am sturdy, Luke." "I know you are," he said. "I only want to—" He paused. "I know what you want," she said quietly. "And I want it too." He stayed down from the mountain almost entirely through the summer of her pregnancy, the practical thinking about the winter preparations taking on a new intensity. He cut and split more firewood than they could possibly need. He built a small addition to the cabin's main room that would serve as a nursery, cedar-planked and tight, with a south-facing window. He reinforced the root cellar steps so they would be safe in ice and darkness. He did all of this with the focused care of a man who had been given something worth protecting and intended to deserve the charge. Grace, for her part, continued working her garden and her orchard with modifications for her condition, but without the drama of helplessness, which he had expected precisely because he knew her. She did less of the heavy digging and more of the planting and tending. She read her botany book and added to it what she was learning about the specific qualities of this particular plot of ground. She wrote long letters to her brother in Missouri and to an old friend in Kansas, and she received letters back that she read at the table with the particular absorbed expression of someone receiving news they have been hoping for. She also began, in the evenings, to knit. This was new. She had never been a needlework woman, had always felt more at home with a spade than a needle, but something about the pregnancy had made her want to make small, warm things, and she sat by the fire in the evenings making inexpert but determined progress on a blanket of soft cream-colored wool, her brow slightly furrowed with the concentration of learning something from the beginning. Luke watched her from across the fire with a feeling he could not keep the evidence of off his face, and she looked up once and caught him looking and said, "Stop that." "Stop what?" he said. "Looking at me like that." "I am not aware," he said, "that there is a law against it." She gave him a look and went back to her knitting, and he smiled at his Homer, and the fire went warm and low, and the October wind moved outside the solid walls. Their son was born on a bitter morning in December of 1875, with snow falling thick and steady outside, and Elsa Pryor presiding as midwife in the calm, competent way that Grace had known she would. Luke was outside for most of it, not because he was sent away, but because he could not hold still, and the cabin was not large enough to contain both his anxiety and the work being done within it. He paced the front of the cabin and split wood that did not need splitting and checked on Samson 3 times, and when Elsa opened the door and said, "You have a son, Luke, and Grace is well," he stood still in the falling snow for a moment with his eyes closed. Then he went inside and sat on the edge of the bed where Grace lay, tired and luminous and entirely herself, with a small tight-wrapped bundle in her arms, and she held it out to him. He took his son with the careful, enormous-handed care of a man who has handled rifle and hatchet and leather and iron all his life, and is now holding something that changes the scale of everything. The baby was red-faced and squinting and had a faint dark fuzz of hair and the squared-off jaw that Luke recognized from his own reflection. "Hello," Luke said very quietly to the baby. Grace watched him from the pillow. "What shall we call him?" she said. They had discussed names in a general way without settling. Now Luke looked up from the baby's face and said, "I would like to call him Thomas if you are willing." Grace went still. Then she reached up and put her hand against Luke's face, and he turned into it and she said, "Yes, I am willing." Thomas Rhodes was a loud, healthy, exceptionally determined child from the beginning. He nursed with the focused intensity of a professional, slept in emphatic blocks, and regarded the world from his south-facing nursery window with an expression of grave assessment that was so purely Grace that it made Luke laugh every time he saw it. He was walking by spring of 1877, into everything by summer, an inexhaustible presence in the apple orchard and the kitchen garden and the creek bank, from which he had to be retrieved on a regular basis. Grace was magnificent with him. She was also matter-of-fact with him in the way she was matter-of-fact about everything, which Luke suspected was the best possible thing for a boy to have a mother who loved him completely and expected him to be capable, who taught him the names of plants and the habits of the creek, and how to tell which way the weather was coming from the look of the clouds over the west ridge. Luke brought him up to the mountain for the first time when Thomas was 2.5, carrying him on his shoulders along the lower trail until the boy fell asleep with his small hands tangled in Luke's hair. And when Grace asked Luke afterward how it had gone, he said, "He pointed at a red-tailed hawk for about 20 minutes." And the expression on his face as he said it was something she put in her journal that night and kept. By 1878, the Crowder Creek parcel had become what Grace had always intended it to be, a small, productive, well-run homestead that paid for itself. The kitchen garden provided most of their food through the winter. The apple orchard, now fully rehabilitated, produced enough fruit that Grace had begun selling preserves and dried apple rings in Rattlesnake Creek, which Mabel Haggerty carried in the store, and which sold steadily enough to be a meaningful contribution to the household stores. The potato crop was strong and reliable. Grace had added a small chicken run along the north fence, and the eggs were steady income as well. Luke's trap lines remained productive, and his annual hunting brought in meat and hides that he sold through the trading post operation in town. They were not rich. No one in Rattlesnake Creek was rich. But they were solid and they were free, and the land was theirs and the life was theirs, and it was built with their own hands. In 1879, Colorado had been a state for 3 years, and the changes were arriving faster than some liked and slower than others wanted. The cattle operations were getting bigger and pushing harder, and the small homesteaders of the valley had to be watchful. The Delaney operation had changed hands and the new owner was less aggressive, which was a relief. The railroad was coming through the territory in a general way, though not to Rattlesnake Creek itself, which maintained its particular character as a place slightly removed from the main current of things, which suited its inhabitants. Thomas was 4 and had recently decided he was going to live on the mountain when he grew up, a declaration he made with a certainty that Luke found enormously gratifying, and Grace found both endearing and slightly worrying. "He is going to be like you," Grace said one evening. "What do you mean by that?" Luke said. "I mean he is going to want to be up in the high country, and he is going to find the valley confining, and he is going to be perfectly self-sufficient and entirely difficult to keep track of." Luke smiled. "Is that so bad?" She looked at him with those gray-green eyes, still the same, still the first thing he thought of in the mornings. "No," she said, "it is not so bad." She was pregnant again, and both of them knew it, had known for a few weeks in the quiet way you know the things you live close enough to. She had not said anything yet, was holding it in that private space she sometimes held things before bringing them out, and he was waiting for her to be ready, in the particular patient way she had taught him to wait for her over the years. She told him on an April evening in 1879, sitting on the front step in the way they still did whenever the weather allowed, with the mountains going rows above the valley and the creek talking below and Thomas asleep inside. "Another one," she said. He took her hand. "Are you well?" he said, the same question he had asked the first time. "I am," she said, "perfectly." Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1879, on a clear October day that smelled of wood smoke and apples. They named her Elsa Margaret, Elsa for the woman who had helped bring Thomas into the world and who had been a steady, quiet presence in both their lives for 5 years, and Margaret for Luke's mother. She was fair where Thomas was dark, calm where he was emphatic, with her father's brown eyes and her mother's squared-off jaw, and a disposition, from the first weeks of her life, of a striking and observant quietness that told you she was taking everything in and filing it away. Elsa Pryor, at the naming, said that she was honored and pressed her lips together firmly and did not cry, which everyone understood as the highest possible compliment from her. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No years in the high country were without difficulty. There was a hard winter in 1880 that tested every preparation they had made and found one or two of them wanting. and Luke spent 3 days breaking through drifted snow to reach the nearest neighbors with supplies when the cold was severe enough to be dangerous. There was a summer in 1882 when the creek ran lower than it ever had before, and the kitchen garden required twice the usual irrigation labor and still came in short, and they ate into the stored reserves and rebuilt them the following year. There was a fever that went through the valley in 1881 that took 3 people in Rattlesnake Creek, none of them people in this family, but all of them known and mourned. But these were the ordinary costs of a life lived on honest terms with the country, and they bore them together in the way they bore everything, with their eyes open and their hands steady, and a clear accounting of what they had and what they owed and what they were building. Thomas grew into exactly the boy Grace had predicted, rangy and self-possessed and deeply interested in the high country in a way that made Luke's chest expand with something he had no adequate name for. By age 7, he was helping check the lower trap lines on the weekends. By age 8, he could read sign in the mud along the creek as well as most grown men. By 9, he had learned to ride and was reliable on horseback. Grace taught him his letters and figures with the same methodical directness she brought to everything, and he was a quick and serious student, and she was proud of him in a way that she expressed not through declaration, but through a particular quality of attention she gave him when he was figuring something out. Elsa grew into something different but equally herself, quieter, more interior, with a passion for the plant life of the valley that Grace recognized and encouraged, and a talent for drawing that neither of her parents had any explanation for, but which produced, by the time she was 6, careful detailed sketches of wild flowers and insects and mountain views that Grace mounted on the cabin wall with a pride she made no effort to conceal. In 1883, Luke brought Thomas up to the high country for the first extended trip, 3 days on the mountain, up in the real high country above the tree line, sleeping in the trail hut Luke had built years ago, and using the summer trap lines and watching the elk come through the high meadow in the long July evenings. When they came back down, Thomas was sunburned and filthy and vibrating with the kind of happiness that comes from a world being confirmed as exactly as magnificent as you believed it was. "Well," Grace said, looking at her son. "He is a mountain man," Luke said. Thomas looked at his father with a directness that was pure grace and said, "Yes, I am." Grace looked between them and felt something so full and particular that it was almost too much to hold. These 2 people she loved, this boy with his father's face and her mother's eyes and the whole high country shining off him, this man who had come into her life before she had said a single word to him and had built everything with her and made everything larger. "Yes," she said, "I believe you are." The spring of 1884 was the most beautiful spring that anyone in Rattlesnake Creek could remember, with the snowmelt coming steady, and the creek running high and clear, and the valley floor erupting in a profusion of wildflowers that Elsa Pryor the younger catalogued in a small notebook that was beginning to look very much like her mother's specimen journal. The apple orchard was in full, riotous bloom, 12 trees of pale pink and white against the deep blue of the spring sky, and the smell of it carried all the way to the cabin on the south wind. Grace stood in the orchard on a morning in May and looked at what 12 trees could become in 10 years with the right care, and felt the particular pride of the long-term project. She pressed her hand against the bark of the first tree she and Luke had pruned together, the largest one, and felt the living warmth of it under her calloused palm. She heard him coming across the meadow grass and did not need to turn to know it was him, the rhythm of his step as familiar as her own heartbeat by now. He came and stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and they looked at the trees together. "Do you remember when you found them?" he said. "I remember you told me they were there," she said. "I might have missed them otherwise." "You would not have," he said. "You were going to walk every inch of this land. You would have found them." She considered this. "Perhaps," she said, "but it helped having you tell me what was there." He turned and looked at her, this woman he had loved from before she ever spoke to him, standing in her apple orchard on a May morning with the blossoms in her hair and her calloused hands and her gray-green eyes and 10 years of built life around them like a country they had made themselves. "Grace," he said. She turned and looked at him with those eyes and waited. "Are you happy?" he said. She did not answer immediately. She never answered immediately, and he had learned to wait for her answers because they were always true, always exactly what she meant, never the decorative version of an answer but the real one. She looked at the orchard, the meadow, the cabin with the blue smoke beginning at the chimney where Thomas was undoubtedly poking at the morning fire and Elsa was probably drawing at the window. She looked at the mountains, enormous and permanent, watching over everything. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. "I am happy," she said. "I am completely and entirely happy, Luke." He took her hand, always her hands first. It would always be her hands, and held it in his, the roughness of her palm against the roughness of his. And she leaned into him in the apple orchard the way she had leaned into him for a decade now, easy and natural and entirely sure. Above them the blossoms moved in the May wind, pale and steady. The creek talked in its old voice below. The mountains stood in all directions, patient and massive, keeping the whole valley in their arms. In the cabin window, a small fair-haired girl pressed her nose to the glass and watched her parents in the orchard and reached for her pencil to draw what she saw. And on the mountain above, the high country kept its ancient silence, indifferent to everything but the weather and the seasons and the long, slow turning of years. Everything that needed to be there was there. Everything that had been built was standing. The hands that had first told a story before a single word was spoken had written that story now in full in the soil and stone and wood of this valley, and it was good, and it was finished, and it was home.